1 million people watched our last report on this case. Since then, everything changed. A funeral has now been scheduled. The family has asked the public for calm. And new reporting, from outlets with no prior connection to this story, is starting to push back against the version of events that turned this into a national conversation. This is not the story we told you before. This is what happened after. Today, in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a mother will bury her son. And in the days leading up to this moment, a case that captured the attention of millions has shifted in ways almost nobody expected. Before we go further, hit subscribe now, because what you're about to hear changes how this entire case looks. This is a true crime documentary, and tonight, we're telling you what really happened. This is where Nolan Wells will be laid to rest. Not at the Mississippi Coast Coliseum, the large convention center just across the water in Biloxi. Days earlier, the Coliseum's commission had voted, without objection, to open its doors for the service. The venue's executive director confirmed the offer publicly and extended condolences on behalf of the building. The offer was real. And then, quietly, without much explanation given to the public, the family said no. They chose the church instead. Smaller, simpler. A building most people outside Ocean Springs had never even heard of before this week. No one close to the family has explained on record why the Coliseum was ultimately turned down. But the decision itself says something worth sitting with. A family stepping back from the biggest platform available to them, towards something quieter. Something that felt less like an event, and more like the place where they'd prayed, married, and buried people before. The Coliseum's director said the venue remains supportive of the family, no matter what they decided, and there was no visible tension in that exchange. Just two parties trying to do right by a family that had already lost more than anyone should have to. Monday, July 20th. Visitation opens at 9 in the morning. 2 hours later, the service begins. A civil rights leader who stood beside this family at their very first press conference, and everyone since, will officiate. By the time he steps to the front of that church, he will have known this family for 3 weeks. It'll feel to everyone watching like far longer. 2 other names have attached themselves to this day, neither from Mississippi, neither related to Nolan. A well-known filmmaker is covering the full cost of the funeral. A former NFL quarterback funded the independent autopsy the family requested weeks earlier, after saying they no longer trusted an examination handled solely by the state. 2 men from entirely different corners of public life, both stepping forward without being asked twice, choosing to carry a financial weight that never should have landed on a grieving family in the first place. That's the scale this case has reached. Not simply a local tragedy along the Mississippi coast, but something public figures have chosen to attach their names and their own resources to, publicly and without hesitation. Think about what that actually means. A family that never sought public life, never asked to be known outside their own community, now has a civil rights icon in their living room, a filmmaker paying for their son's casket, and a former professional athlete funding the search for answers their own state was supposed to provide for free. None of them asked for this. All of it arrived anyway, because their son didn't come home, and because the questions surrounding that absence would not stay quiet. After the service, the day continues at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, where the family has planned a smaller gathering. Nolan's mother has been deliberate about who she wants present. Family, friends, Nolan's football teammates, a limited number of media, invited rather than assumed. In the days before, she stated publicly that all official updates about the funeral and reception would come only from her, or from the family's attorney. A small but telling boundary, from a mother trying to hold on to some control, in a story that has moved almost entirely beyond her. There's something worth noticing in that boundary. A mother, 3 weeks into the worst experience of her life, still finding the discipline to manage a message, to protect a narrative, to make sure that whatever gets said about her son's final day comes from people who actually loved him. It's a small act of authorship, in a story the rest of the country has been writing without her permission. Go back further, though. Before the funeral planning, before the press conferences, before any of this carried a name recognized across the country, public frustration had already started spilling into the streets. Friends of Nolan's organized a small demonstration in Ocean Springs, just days after his body was found. Unconnected to the family, driven by the same unanswered questions that would eventually pull this case into national headlines. Teenagers who had known him from hallways and locker rooms and Friday night games stood on a sidewalk, holding signs, doing the only thing available to people their age who feel powerless against something this large. It wasn't organized, it wasn't polished. It was grief, looking for somewhere to go. Weeks later, standing in front of a wall of cameras, Nolan's mother made a request that stands apart from almost everything else said in this case. She wasn't asking reporters, investigators, or the state of Mississippi for a particular outcome. She simply asked that anyone planning to demonstrate, even on the day of the funeral, do so peacefully, adding that her son would never have wanted conflict connected to his name. Consider what that request represents. A mother, days from burying her son, chose to use one of her limited public statements not to demand accountability, not to name a suspect, but to ask strangers she will never meet to exercise restraint at his funeral. Somewhere inside that request is a fear she hasn't said out loud, a fear that the day meant to honor her son could become something else entirely, something loud, something combustible, something that makes his funeral about everyone except him. That she felt the need to say this at all shows just how far this case has traveled beyond the young man at its center. Somewhere between a 4th of July boat trip and a Monday morning service, Nolan Wells stopped belonging only to his family. He became a symbol to some, a flashpoint to others, and a name now carrying a weight his mother never wanted, and now feels responsible for managing, even while grieving. Long before any of this, Nolan Wells was simply a wide receiver with a future ahead of him. On National Signing Day, months before any of what would follow, he spoke to a local news crew about what it meant to keep playing football alongside teammates he already considered family. There was nothing complicated about him in that moment. No controversy, no hashtag, just a young man in a school gymnasium, grinning about the season ahead, surrounded by people he trusted enough to call brothers. That was the version of Nolan Wells that existed before Horn Island, before a boat trip, before a name known nationally for reasons no 18-year-old should ever be known. It's worth pausing on that footage, if only in memory, because it's the last version of him that belongs entirely to himself. Everything that came after belongs, in some sense, to the public now. The interviews, the press conferences, the speculation. But that gymnasium, that smile, that ordinary teenage pride in his own future, that still belongs to Nolan. His mother's request for peace will matter more than viewers might initially realize. Once Nolan Wells is laid to rest, a different kind of countdown begins. The investigation doesn't end with the funeral. But public attention to cases shaped like this one has a way of fading once the cameras leave the parking lot, once the vans pull away, once the next story arrives to take up the same amount of space this one currently occupies. What happens to a case like this once public attention moves elsewhere isn't a hypothetical question. It's the question this family will be living inside of, starting the moment the last car leaves the church. And it's worth remembering plainly, grief doesn't follow the same timeline as a news cycle. Long after the cameras stop coming, this family will still be waking up every morning to the same absence. There's now a recorded exchange that, until recently, only a small number of investigators had heard. A voice, urgent, contacting a private towing company somewhere off the coast near Horn Island, reporting that the boat was taking on water and that everyone on board was accounted for. That call didn't come from Nolan. It came from the boat his friends were on, the same boat that carried them back to the mainland that afternoon without him. For nearly 2 weeks, one detail sat at the center of public suspicion. Why did the group leave the island without Nolan? Why wasn't help called sooner? This recording doesn't answer that directly, but it adds something to the account. It confirms the boat itself was having a mechanical problem in the hours after Nolan was last seen, and that the group contacted outside help before making it back to shore. Picture that afternoon for a second, not as a headline, but as it likely felt to the people living through it. A boat taking on water somewhere off a barrier island. No cell service. A group of teenagers realizing something's going wrong beneath their feet. And somewhere behind them, on land they could no longer see, a friend who wasn't with them. 2 separate emergencies unfolding at once, on the same stretch of water, on the same afternoon. It's impossible to know from an audio recording alone whether the panic in that call had anything to do with the earlier decision to leave the island. But it's impossible, too, to hear it and not wonder. What this recording explains is a portion of the sequence of events. What it doesn't explain, and was never going to explain, is the decision that came earlier that afternoon on the shore of Horn Island to leave without the friend they arrived with. That decision stands apart from any mechanical trouble that followed it, and it remains one of the central, unanswered questions in this case. Around the same time this recording surfaced, another piece of evidence emerged from an entirely separate source. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources released GPS data tracking the boat's exact movements that day. Not memory, not an account reconstructed weeks after a chaotic afternoon, shaped, however unintentionally, by fear or guilt, or the simple unreliability of human recollection. A recorded digital trail, coordinates and timestamps, evidence that doesn't shift depending on who's telling the story, or how many times they've had to tell it. This data doesn't, on its own, establish where Nolan was in his final hours. It can't do that. But it establishes with certainty where the boat was and when it moved. In a case where nearly every account of that afternoon has been questioned by someone, a piece of evidence that can't be reshaped by memory carries a different kind of weight. Then there's the question of who exactly is involved in this investigation, and why that detail alone has fueled speculation. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter confirmed publicly that the FBI is assisting his department, specifically with the forensic review of digital evidence collected so far. For a case that's already drawn national coverage, federal involvement tends to suggest something bigger beneath the surface, at least to a public that spent 3 weeks searching for meaning in every new detail. Ledbetter addressed it directly. Horn Island sits on federal land, protected under the Gulf Islands National Seashore. His department, he explained, works with the FBI routinely on cases connected to that jurisdiction, and this involvement follows standard procedure rather than signaling an escalation. What's not in question is the scale of the effort underway. Ledbetter confirmed his department has now interviewed more than 60 witnesses, including in-depth interviews with the 3 friends who were on the boat with Nolan that day. 60 conversations, 60 separate accounts, cross-referenced, compared, checked against a growing body of physical evidence. That number reflects weeks of steady, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes headlines on its own, but quietly supports every other finding in this case going forward. If there's one piece of evidence that could reshape this case in the weeks ahead, it isn't the recording, it isn't the GPS data, it isn't even the witness count. It's smaller than all of that. It fits in the palm of a hand, Nolan's phone. His mother has said publicly, more than once, that when the phone was recovered, messages appeared to be missing. Content her son would ordinarily have shared during the hours before he disappeared. For weeks, that claim stood as an allegation, a mother's suspicion, repeated at press conference after press conference, but not independently confirmed. That's now changed. Following a meeting between the family's attorneys and the Jackson County District Attorney, both sides agreed to something unusual, described by a legal expert familiar with the case as far from standard procedure. A joint inspection of the phone, with experts representing the family and experts representing the DA's office examining the device together, at the same time, so neither side controls how the findings are later described publicly. Under typical circumstances, evidence like this stays solely with law enforcement, released only when investigators choose to release it. This case hasn't followed that pattern, and that departure says something about how much pressure has built around this investigation, and how much this arrangement is meant to address. It's, in its own quiet way, an admission from both sides that trust alone won't be enough. Only a shared, verifiable process will do that. There's one more development from this same stretch of the investigation, and it calls for care rather than urgency. Around the same time the witness count was announced, federal investigators confirmed they are also investigating threats made against individuals connected to this case. One of Nolan's close friends, who was on the island that day, told reporters he and others close to the case have received threats since Nolan's death became national news, and that it's caused him real concern, both for his friends and for his own family. A teenager already carrying the weight of losing a friend, already answering the same questions from investigators and reporters over and over, now also carrying fear for his own safety and the safety of people he loves. What matters here isn't the identity of anyone involved, it's the pattern now emerging. A case that began with a family asking for basic transparency has grown large enough, quickly enough, to put real people on more than one side of this story at risk. That's not a footnote. That's a warning about what happens when a private tragedy becomes public property. Strip away the recording, the GPS data, the interviews, and the phones still waiting to be examined. Here's where this case stands tonight. On the eve of the funeral, there is still no official cause of death. 3 weeks after Nolan Wells was found in the water off Horn Island, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office has released no finding, pending or otherwise. The office is still waiting on toxicology results, a process that cannot be rushed, regardless of national attention. Outside laboratories conduct that testing, and review takes weeks, sometimes longer, no matter how many cameras are watching, no matter how many people are asking why it's taking so long. A spokesperson for Mississippi's Department of Public Safety addressed the pace directly, stating that every case deserves a thorough review, and that cases cannot all be handled on the same timeline. That's not a dismissal of public frustration. It reflects how forensic science actually works, whether or not the public finds the pace satisfying. Somewhere in that gap between what a family needs to hear and what a laboratory is able to confirm, 3 weeks have already passed, and a funeral is happening before a single official cause of death has been announced. That gap isn't evidence of anything on its own. It doesn't point toward wrongdoing, and it doesn't confirm an accident. It's simply where the process currently stands, 3 weeks in, and it's why so many questions raised throughout this investigation remain open as the family prepares to say goodbye. There are no charges. Not against the 3 friends who were with Nolan on Horn Island, and not against anyone else connected to this case. 3 weeks of interviews, more than 60 witnesses, federal assistance with digital evidence, GPS data, recorded audio, and as of tonight, none of it has produced an arrest. That's not unusual. Investigations built on this much evidence and this many moving parts rarely resolve in a matter of weeks. When they resolve, it's typically over months. Public urgency doesn't change the pace at which toxicology labs, forensic units, and prosecutors are required to operate. What comes next has already been outlined, even if the outcome hasn't. The district attorney has confirmed that once the investigation concludes, the findings will go before a grand jury, which will determine whether the case proceeds to criminal charges. The family's attorney has said he expects every relevant piece of evidence to be placed before that jury, with nothing held back. Whether that standard is met remains to be seen, because the investigation itself is still active, still gathering pieces, still weeks away from anything resembling a conclusion. Set expectations accordingly. This case isn't moving toward a fast resolution, and never was. The toxicology results alone could take additional weeks. The grand jury process, once triggered, adds further time, with no fixed date attached. Cases carrying this much evidence and this much public attention typically stretch across months, not days. For a family already exhausted by 3 weeks of waiting, that isn't an easy truth to sit with, but it's the truth. Which brings us to today. By the time this reaches you, Nolan Wells may already be laid to rest. A community that watched him grow up, and a country that never met this 18-year-old until his name became attached to a story few expected to follow this closely, gathering to say goodbye to someone who, 3 weeks earlier, was simply preparing for a holiday weekend with friends. His mother will be there, the same woman who says she still watches old recordings just to hear her son's laugh again. His father will be there. Teammates and friends will be there, young men who will spend the rest of their lives measuring every future 4th of July against this one. And somewhere among them, a wider audience that never met Nolan Wells will sit quietly for one day before attention moves on the way it typically does. There's something worth sitting with in that image. A church full of people who knew him, surrounded at a distance by millions who only know his name. Grief in this case has become both deeply private and completely public at the same time, and there's no clean way to separate the two anymore. Rest easy, Nolan. The investigation doesn't pause for today. The lab doesn't close its doors because a family is grieving. The grand jury process continues quietly in the background, regardless of the calendar. But public attention often does pause, drifting toward whatever comes next, the way it usually does. The way it always has for stories like this one. Whether that shift changes anything about how this case moves forward is the question worth watching in the weeks ahead. A family has already shown, through 3 weeks of press conferences and painstaking public patience, that they intend to keep asking it, whether or not the rest of the country is still listening. If you want the grand jury update the moment it happens, and if you want to see how today's service unfolds, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This story is not finished, and neither is our coverage of it.